Hello everyone. I'm honored to be here today at the Tactile Reading 2021 conference. I certainly wish we could have been meeting in Norway, but I guess all of us are getting more and more accustomed to virtual conferences and meetings. On the right-hand side of this title page, The Bumpy Road to Literacy, there's an image of a hand on the page of a Braille book, and the fingers are spread out while reading. And this image is placed above an image which I imagine looks like the curved side of our planet, Earth, in the night sky. The Earth is pictured with lots of bright yellow and red dots spaced evenly across it. It makes me think of the network of the hundreds of people in the world who are involved in Braille literacy. The dots also make the world look a bit bumpy and a bit like the images I've seen of the coronavirus, which is the main reason we're all here virtually today. Before we hit the road, I need to acknowledge that I have not taught reading in any language other than English. And as you all know, English Braille contains contractions. And I tell you this because those of you teaching Braille reading in another language with a Braille code that's different to English may have some thoughts or questions related to how this applies to teaching reading and writing in your language and your Braille code's presentation of that language, representation of that language. And if so, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to contact me via my email, which is at the end of the PowerPoint. I also want to mention that the Word version of this speech contains the list of references and resources at the end. Pulling this keynote speech together was like a walk down memory lane for me. Ever since I first began teaching at the New York State School for the Blind in 1968, I've been enamored and fascinated by Braille itself and how to teach reading and writing using Braille. I wanted to pull together all the things I've learned about literacy instruction for all of our students and clients with visual impairments. What I remembered and what I learned from my walk down memory lane forms the basis of this talk, The Bumpy Road to Literacy. And apologies for my somewhat corny reference to the bumps that make up Braille, but it is a tactile reading conference after all. So what is literacy? Most of the definitions one finds can be boiled down to what is on this slide. Literacy is the condition or quality of being literate, especially the ability to read and write. Print literacy is what's normally assumed, but there were some instances I found where this was applied to tactile literacy, extending the definition to include the ability to read and write using the sense of touch, which for the most part assumes that the medium is Braille, and for the most part assumes it's the fingers doing the reading, but that can be different too. So the second aspect of literacy is the condition or quality of being knowledgeable in a particular subject or field. And you might think of computer literacy or cultural literacy, or we talk of Braille literacy or digital literacy. To me, the process of learning to read and write is part of the larger process of becoming literate. We can't become literate without learning to read and write, but literacy is more than just decoding, learning to form letters, spelling words correctly, decoding. So what makes this road bumpy? So some of the bumps lie within the individual and their individual circumstances. And some bumps are created by our expectations. Some are created because of a mismatch between the reading program and the reader, and some are created by a lack of knowledge or experience on the part of teachers. Let's start with the first bump. Bumps within the individual and their individual circumstances. So, for whom the road is bumpy is written in a huge bump or dot on the left-hand side of this slide. And on the right-hand side, you'll see I've divided this group of individuals into three groups. The first group has a very diverse set of bumps and is children who are born with a severe visual impairment or who have additional disabilities, including English language learning. The second is children and teenagers who lose vision due to trauma or a degenerative eye condition during their school years. And the last group is adults who lose vision at any stage in their adult life, including post-secondary school to working life through retirement and old age. So thinking about children with or without additional disabilities and the early literacy stage, early literacy is the term that's used today to replace terms like pre-reading or pre-Braille or reading readiness or Braille readiness. And the rationale for the replacement of these pre or readiness terms comes partly from seeing students remain in these readiness stages on the assumption that the skills included were skills that had to be learned before children could be exposed to formal reading instruction. The term early literacy has us thinking of readers as emergent readers and sees this early literacy time as a stage of development where students engage in a variety of activities that are moving them towards learning to read and write. So bumps in the early literacy experience. One of these bumps is expectations of both parents and teachers. Will this child be a reader, print, or Braille? When a child is born, parents don't generally question whether their child will be a reader. But if a child is born with a disability, and especially one that means that they can't see the world clearly, parents begin to question. They may develop low expectations for their child in terms of reading, or their expectations may be considered too high by some teachers who feel they're being too unrealistic. Without expectations that a child will be able to read, teachers and parents don't think about things with an eye towards literacy, about including literacy building activities with a child. And this becomes a vicious cycle, where because of low expectations, the child isn't exposed to those very things that will help them develop literacy. Early intervention teachers need to have expectations that a child will learn to read so that they can pass those expectations on to the parents and help them create the sort of early literacy environment in the home that will enable these children to move, even if it's at a slower pace, towards becoming able to read and write. What can often complicate the situation is the child's visual status. Parents of children who have eye conditions where they have some vision or other than light perception or even light projection may not think about Braille as a literacy medium. This can become a very emotional issue with some parents, to the point where they begin to think that Braille might stigmatize their child, or that learning Braille might somehow make their vision worse. I remember the situation of an early childhood teacher who was in one of my training classes working towards her master's degree in education of children with visual impairments. She told the class about a meeting that she had had with the parents where she had brought up the idea of Braille as a literacy medium for their child. Afterwards, the mother said to her, "I just knew that at some point you would bring up the B word, but I'm just having such a hard time with it." And so they ended up having a heart-to-heart talk about how this, and the result was that the mother became more open to her child having exposure to Braille. The issue of whether a child will be a print or Braille reader is not an issue that can wait until a child is in school, or until the child loses enough vision that Braille becomes the most viable medium. The amount of research that has been done with students who did not hit the road with Braille early on indicates that losing those developmental years can be harmful to their ability to learn to read. If children haven't begun reading Braille before second or third grade in school, their chances of becoming literate and fluent readers of Braille are much lower. Early childhood specialists need to be cognizant of what those degenerative eye conditions are so that they can advocate for the child's exposure to Braille. And they need to be able to determine whether a child has enough vision to read print without enlarging the print so much that it destroys the ability to read quickly and accurately and fluently. Keep in mind that this doesn't mean that print would not be taught, but learning Braille does need a bit more time than print if it's to be learned, since it isn't everywhere for the student to access. Sometimes that takes a bit of advocacy on the part of the early intervention teacher for children with visual impairments. And I'm aware that I'm preaching to the choir here. So learning about your world through language and communication. Let's start with concrete experiences and concept development. Children with visual impairments, even without additional disabilities, have difficulty learning concepts that are things that I call the twos. Too far away, too large, too small, too hot, too cold, too dangerous, and so on. The list goes on and on. Most children don't have the luxury, as one of my blind friends did when she was growing up, of having a father who had access to a cherry picker. So she had numerous experiences of getting in the cherry picker basket with her father and having one of her father's co-workers raise them up into the air so he could help her explore what was too high above her for her to get her hands on otherwise. How many kids have that experience? She explored church steeples, apple trees, the roof of her house, windows on the outside of her bedroom, and many other things that her father thought of to show her that he knew otherwise she wouldn't be able to comprehend as well if she didn't have this concrete experience of feeling it. As she said, my father loved having a blind child so he could show me the world that he saw through his eyes. Her telling me that story reminded me also of a story that was written by a father whose daughter was blind and one day asked him if he had a bathroom toilet plunger and where was it. She'd somehow heard about one and she wanted to see it. He couldn't bring himself to let her touch the one in the bathroom, and so began a series of trips to a store that has lots of home equipment and supplies. I've included the link to that article, Daddy, Where's the Plunger, in the references. As his daughter had more and more questions about what she saw, he learned more and more about his daughter benefiting from having as much physical access as possible to all of the things that are in the world around them. And these experiences need to be concrete and allow the child to interact with the environment in learning the concepts and vocabulary. Range and variety of experiences and learning by doing. If you recognize that these are the 3 needs for learning expressed for Bertold Lowenfeld some 40 years ago, you get a virtual bump buster. Having a wide range of experiences is what allows students to be better readers. If you think about it, you can't infer something you've read if you don't understand the vocabulary or if you haven't had the experience yourself. And the need for learning by doing means that your learning needs to be active. You need to be actively engaged in the experience, not just something like walking through the zoo and listening and smelling what's there, but using your hands to touch and feel as much as possible for you. There's a phrase that I constantly repeat when I'm teaching about reading, and it's from the report Becoming a Nation of Readers by Anderson et al., 1985. The authors wrote, "Reading is a process in which information from the text and the knowledge possessed by the reader act together to produce meaning. Good readers skillfully integrate information in the text with what they already know." In other words, what you bring to the reading process determines what you take away. So think about what this means. What you bring to the reading process determines what you take away. This statement puts a lot of the bumps in the road in perspective. What you need to understand when you think of this statement is that each reader comes to reading with a different background of experiences, knowledge, schemas, abilities, interests, and vocabulary to express those interests and experiences, which will influence how that individual will interpret what is being read. To be able to interact with text, the words on the page must have some relevance to the reader. To be able to infer, the reader has to have the knowledge of the topic about which he is reading. Whenever a student answers a question about a passage with the statement, "Well, the story doesn't tell us the answer," I know we have some knowledge building to do. We also need to be sure that the environment contains symbols and tools for reading and writing Braille. Print, Braille books, Braillers, technology, everything we can get our hands on. We also need to be sure that the environment provides models of reading and writing. When children can't see, they can't see that people around them are reading and writing all the time. They don't know what uses are there for it. This is where the early intervention teacher can be invaluable. The early intervention teacher can model writing on the Brailler for the student. They can have the student ride their hands when reading a story to model for the student how to move one's hands in reading Braille. They can help their student move their hands across the Braille page in a storybook in this way. And they can help provide a Braille-rich environment full of Braille in places where it makes sense for the Braille to be. And this is why it's so important that early intervention specialists and preschool teachers know Braille and have experience with early literacy needs, including assessments. This isn't a time for the early intervention teacher to be learning Braille. The early intervention teacher can't be a model for Braille writing or reading or create a Braille-rich environment if they don't know Braille. So these are what we need: preschool teachers who know Braille and have experience with early literacy activities, including assessments. We haven't talked specifically about children with multiple disabilities, but it's important to recognize that children with multiple disabilities make up around 60% of our population. And the time that parents spend with their children with multiple disabilities are oftentimes during early childhood, where they're seeing doctors, specialists, visiting clinics, learning how to take care of children who can't take care of themselves in ways that many parents never expected to experience. It's hard to keep an eye on language and communication and literacy when children's needs are so complex. Having multiple disabilities contributes to more bumps. It makes it more difficult to have positive expectations and to include the child in learning language and communication and in interacting with the environment. So it's even more important that the early childhood specialist assist them with those things. Learning language and experiences go hand in hand, and they need to be combined with stories about what the children are learning so that they can see how what they're learning transposes into the reading of a book. One of the best things that we can do for children is to give them the language that describes what they're going through. And this is as much for children with additional disabilities as it is with children who are learning English as a second language. Excuse me. One of the parents that I worked with created a set of books for her daughter about the various visits to the hospital that they had taken. And she named the doctors that her daughter had gotten comfortable with and the various procedures that she had done. This type of language experience approach story lets children understand that reading is something that holds meaning for them and gives them exposure to the physical act of reading a book or story. Deaf-blindness. Deaf-blindness and learners with English language both have issues related to language learning, although they're not on the same spectrum. Both of them require additional expertise on the part of the early childhood specialist. That early childhood specialist may not have that expertise, so collaboration with someone who does is very necessary. The addition of a hearing impairment to a visual impairment in early childhood isn't a bump, it's a huge boulder. And it's a huge boulder in the way of the development of learning about one's world. Again, the typical early childhood specialist who works with children with visual impairment most likely will not have expertise in deaf-blindness and shouldn't be expected to know how to work with a student with deaf-blindness, especially because the acquisition of language is so much more important for these children and so much more difficult. Specialists who help parents with these children need a multitude of skills, and it's often difficult to have one teacher who has them all. What parents need is resources for those experts in the area of their child's multiple disabilities. An early childhood specialist should let parents know their limitations and help parents find those individuals who have the best information available to them to facilitate their child's learning about their world during this very crucial period of development. The National Center on Deaf-Blindness has good resources for parents on their website, which has specific suggestions for early literacy. The elementary school years also contain bumps for our students, with or without additional disabilities. If there was no decision on whether the child would be a print or Braille reader in their early childhood years, this decision is even more critical at the start of elementary school for the same reason that we mentioned previously. Attitudes toward Braille as a literacy medium may come into play again at the time a child enters preschool or elementary school. Depending upon the child's degree of vision or being totally blind or having additional disabilities, it may be decided by someone that Braille isn't the most important medium for literacy at this point. A lot of this has to do with an underlying attitude towards Braille as, shall we say, a second-class literacy medium, and what people say about Braille demonstrates this. I'm wondering if any of you have ever heard anyone say something like the following. So I think it's time, I don't want to have to tell you this, but I guess that we're going to bite the bullet, and it's really time that we need to teach him print. Yes, you heard me right. I said print, and I don't imagine that you've ever heard that statement. But time and time again, I have heard teachers say something similar about teaching Braille reading to students. And unfortunately, the timing of this statement is not always at the beginning of kindergarten or first grade. It's more often likely in third or fourth grade when the statement is made. When a child enters elementary school, it's critical that the learning media assessment be done again. Teachers must pay careful attention to the eye condition of the student, to be aware of fatigue factors when the child is using vision, and to determine as quickly as possible when the medium should be Braille. Expectations that children who have severe multiple disabilities have the capacity to acquire Braille literacy is extremely important. What is interesting to me is how little it takes for people to change their expectations and attitudes about kids' abilities to read and write after kids begin to show even a very minimal interest or ability. For example, at one point I was doing a bi-weekly Friday afternoon professional development program around my I Am Able, and this was at with teachers at a school for the blind. Several of the teachers were very skeptical about their students who had severe multiple disabilities, that they would ever be candidates for Braille literacy instruction, and they voiced their skepticism. So their task for the week was to put Braille labels in their classroom, starting with having the kids' names in Braille on their lockers, their desks, their cubbies, and any other place they could think of. And they were also, after they'd gotten the labels placed, to make sure that the kids got their fingers on the Braille and saw other kids' Braille labels as well as their own, and then to be told that these labels were their names and to read the names to them. That was it. Nothing fancy. They were to report back the next session. So even before the next session, I was surprised from their supervisor that she was hearing some excitement from the teachers as the students became interested in the labels and they wanted to see each other's names. Even those students who were nonverbal were showing an interest in the labels. And by the next meeting, the teachers were very willing to do the next step in moving their students towards Braille literacy, and I heard very little skepticism. Another instance of this was working with teachers in public school settings with a variety of students who had not yet been successful in learning to read Braille. And as the year progressed, and as the students began to themselves make some progress, which ranged greatly, over the course of that year we had students who learned to read from 80 to 120 words in Braille, and they were writing and reading stories. And then we had others who were just reading maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 words. But each teacher who was working with a student began to report that other teachers in the school had become interested in what they were doing with their student, and that they were more engaging with the student, asking them about their reading and what words they knew. One student who was only able to recognize 4 words was selected as the student to talk to an evaluation team coming to the school. They asked him what he liked best about being at his school, and he immediately responded, Braille. So just as in the early years, in elementary school, it's important to have teachers of children with visual impairment who are experienced in teaching Braille literacy, who understand Braille and the unique requirements of tactile readers, who know how to teach reading and writing and make it interesting and engaging, who advocate for the use of access technology with their students. But there are several problems with this need. One problem is something we've been talking about for years, and it's still with us, and that is the critical shortage of teachers of the visually impaired, especially for those who are receiving their elementary instruction in the regular school settings, and especially when it comes to Braille literacy. In the United States, there simply are not enough training programs to meet the need, and I don't think the United States is unique in this difficulty. Often, teachers are receiving their specialized training when they're already in teaching positions. When a teacher with the skills to teach Braille is located, it's often the more academic students who receive instruction from that teacher. Students who have additional disabilities are often relegated to classrooms with other students with additional disabilities, and the TVI serves as a consultant, which doesn't lead to much time for literacy instruction, particularly in Braille. In their university training programs, TVIs learn the Braille code in a course that usually is 1 semester long. They may or may not have a Braille reading student in their practicum experience. They may or may not have a course on teaching reading in Braille, and they may or may not have any coursework in teaching reading and writing in general to print readers to develop an understanding of what is happening in the regular elementary classrooms. Very few programs require a practicum in an elementary classroom where they might see teaching reading and writing in progress. When they graduate from their training programs, they may or may not be assigned to a beginning Braille reader student. They may or may not have training or practice working with children with additional disabilities and their special needs in learning Braille literacy. They graduate as novice teachers of children with visual impairments and novice teachers of Braille literacy. The writers of the book, How People Learn, Brain, Mind, Experience, and School, make some important statements about the comparison of novices to experts. They say, people who have developed expertise in particular areas are, by definition, able to think effectively about problems in those areas. Expert teachers know the kinds of difficulties that students are likely to face. They know how to tap into students' existing knowledge in order to make new information meaningful, and they know how to assess their students' progress. Expert teachers have acquired pedagogical content knowledge as well as content knowledge. And in the absence of pedagogical content knowledge, teachers often rely on textbook publishers for decisions about how best to organize subjects for their students. And here is where the methods teacher in me wants to be able to talk about all the skills a teacher of children who are Braille readers should know. By the time I did this, we'd be way beyond the end of this presentation. So the time I have just won't permit me to talk about things like hand movements and finger position and tracking skills and teaching writing and enabling two-handed reading and putting a non-slip mat under the Braille, proper fingering on the Brailler, and the list goes on, not to mention how to actually get kids to learn to read. These are the elements of a good professional training program for teachers of clients or students who will be Braille readers. And there's now a good body of research and publications that give teachers this information. We have Anna Swenson's book, Beginning with Braille, and we have the book Reading Connections by Kamei, Hannon, and Ricci. Both are great resources, and there are many others. Children in the middle school or high school years still have needs related to continued work with expanding vocabulary, to include vocabulary from English language arts, from other subjects such as history, social studies, science, and mathematics, and working on things like developing fluency. Students need to learn how to access materials in Braille, and they need to learn the use of audio recording so that it doesn't let it become the literacy medium necessarily. Students with additional disabilities may not be at the same level as their more academically oriented peers, but this doesn't mean giving up on literacy for them. Rather, it means figuring out ways to keep their literacy learning active and relevant. Some students of middle school and high school age may still not have learned to read well enough for them to participate in the regular subject matter with any relevant understanding. For those students, we need to continue to provide instruction to them at a level that matches with their abilities. Sometimes it means that we may need to change the manner in which we are teaching them. Back in 1977, I was an education consultant at Overbrook School for the Blind and was asked to help with 3 girls who were ages 16 to 18 and who had still not learned to read all the letters of the alphabet. Their teachers were just about ready to give up on trying to teach them Braille. Working with those students was what began my thinking about what I now call I Am Able, the individualized, meaning-centered approach to Braille literacy education. We adapted the approach that Sylvia Ashton Warner had used in her book Teacher, where she told how she had worked with illiterate Maori students in New Zealand and taught them to read using key vocabulary words that reflected their experiences that were meaningful to them, rather than trying to teach them to read with the existing New Zealand primers, which had no relevance in their lives. We started introducing whole words to the three girls, words that were meaningful to them, picked from the songs they sang in chorus, the girly kinds of things they liked, the experiences that they had, and just what happened to be of interest to them at the particular time we had our lessons. And since they had learned some letters, we used the words to work backwards, to talk about the letters that made up the words and the sounds of those letters. The letters became more relevant when they were connected with the words that they knew. We wrote stories with them about things they liked and expanded their vocabularies while we were writing those stories. The approach worked. By the time they graduated, they were each able to read contracted Braille at about a second or third grade level and use it for recipes, for phone numbers, for notes, for letters, for other tasks which they needed to use literacy for. That was the beginning of the development of this approach, which has evolved over the past 25 years into what is today written about in the book I Am Able. So far we've been talking about these children who were born with vision impairments that have been with them since birth. And at this point, I want to switch to see what the differences might be in that bumpy road to literacy for the second set of those. I've highlighted that group in the middle on this slide. It's the group of children and teenagers who lose vision due to trauma or a degenerative eye condition during their school years. There are a lot of factors that can either make this a bumpy situation for them or make it less bumpy. The later in school this trauma or loss of vision occurs, the more difficult it is to fit in the time required for learning to read Braille, even when the student has been successfully reading in print. A student who is still in the stages of learning to read that can occur in early elementary school may be able to transfer that learning to Braille more easily than a high school student who is taking a regular school curriculum and is using reading as a tool for learning and needs to learn to read again to access the curriculum. The early elementary school student has some time before needing to use reading as a tool for learning, and so may be able to catch up if the teacher recognizes and is able to provide the amount of time that will be needed for students to get to that point. The high schooler may not even be motivated to try to learn to read all over again. So the use of audio learning may be something that is introduced to tide the student over until he becomes more proficient in Braille. But it then might also become the means by which the student decides to access all of his information rather than learning to read again. So the relevance of instruction and the time for instruction and learning to read are important factors to consider when teachers have students who are at the risk for not becoming literate due to the timing of their need for Braille instruction. If Braille instruction is being conducted and the student is motivated, the challenge becomes how to help the student infuse his Braille reading instruction with the particular curricular activities that are going on in the regular classroom or the special subject areas for which the reading level might even be above what the student is capable of currently reading in Braille. Speed is one of the factors also, since the new Braille reader will not be as fast as needed to access large amounts of instructional materials within the courses the students enrolled in. Use of Braille access technology can be helpful to the students. Since it can be used for writing in Braille, which is generally easier to learn, Braille note takers are kinder to those who don't know all of their contractions. And the student can also use it to read some of the curriculum materials needed for classes if they're in an accessible format. Such technology also just has appeal. It's fun to learn. Learning to use computer technology can also assist the learner to continue in classes. But again, anything that makes it easier not to use Braille means that the Braille instruction might be put off until there is more time to learn it. Teachers who have high expectations for their students' ability to learn Braille in order to use it quickly will generally make more of an attempt to provide some intensive, immersive Braille learning experiences for the student during time when classes are not in session in order to help the student get up to the reading capacity needed for his classes. Reliance on audio reading. It's probably one of the more potent factors in keeping upper elementary to secondary school students from being motivated to learn Braille. And please understand that I'm not saying not to use audio. I'm just saying don't let it be something that keeps someone from learning Braille. And again, we're back to those knowledgeable teachers who have worked with this type of student long enough to know what motivates them, what helps keep them going through their middle and high school years. And expectations are still a factor. And models of people who use Braille enhance those expectations for students who may not think it will be useful. We're now at that third category of those for whom the road is bumpy. These are adults who lose vision at any stage in their adult life, including post-secondary school to working life through retirement and old age. That's an exceptionally large group of people. The bumps in the road for these adults who are potential Braille readers are much bigger in some ways than for children. When I think of the difference between working with adults as compared with working with students, the biggest factor deterring these folks from learning Braille is that they're no longer in a system from which they automatically receive services. They have to ask for them. Whether it's a college student working with the College Services for Students with Disabilities or an adult who has been working and needs services provided through a rehabilitation agency, the individual is the one who initiates the asking for services for the most part. Adults may not even know about services that will help them with visual impairments, and even if they do know, they may not want to request services from their local departments for the blind. They will tell you they aren't blind, they just can't see well. And even when they ask for services for help, perhaps with cooking or doing laundry or some other daily living skills tasks, their rehabilitation teacher may not necessarily push them towards Braille reading. The feeling is that these adults are adults who can choose what they want to spend their rehabilitation time on doing, and that's certainly true, but they also don't know some things about Braille that we would want to learn them. So the hurdles for Braille are shown on the list of this slide. Getting them into the system, that's what we just talked about. Expectations, adult, teacher, family, the newly blinded adult may not think that they're capable of learning to read again, especially in a medium which all they know about is that it's on the ATM machines near their banks and in elevators where they have felt it and remarked that they don't know how someone could ever read it. They may already be feeling less capable because they can't do things that they used to be able to do, and they have to rely on people to help them. This makes some people feel like a failure. They may not be very willing to try something new that they might fail at. Adults' needs and desires related to reading combined with their prior reading level. These are things, some may have been avid readers, but don't see how they could begin to read Braille any faster than using a recorded book, or maybe they only read the newspaper or short pieces on their iPhones. If they're computer literate, they may learn that they can get a program that speaks the computer to them and have some friends to help them with this. There are lots of things that may make them think that Braille isn't going to be helpful to them. And for those who are teaching Braille literacy to adults and who've convinced them to learn, there are very few teaching materials which are really geared to adult needs. The ones that exist are generally very scripted approaches. They don't necessarily take into account the reasons for which adults might want to read. Their slow pace may be a big turnoff for somebody who doesn't feel they have all the time in the world to learn to read. Another thing that is a factor is the native language of the adult, and that can play into whether they wish to learn Braille. Back in 1989, I was working for AFB in San Francisco, and I learned about some Hmong refugees who were being served at a rehabilitation agency there. And the instructors recognized that many of these people didn't know how to read even in their native language. And they were trying to teach them English at the same time they were trying to teach them Braille. They felt they were having to develop all of their own teaching materials since they were trying to do two things at once. And at first they didn't feel they had been successful. So as they were beginning to develop their reading materials, these were students who were helping them and trying to help them in learning how to do this. And they were beginning to see more buy-in from their students and feeling a bit more success by being responsive to their learners' needs and desires in learning to read. Some adults have limitations in their tactile sensitivity. I had a friend who was a veteran and was receiving services from the VA. He was in his late 70s when he learned Braille. He'd been taught jumbo Braille due to his decreased sensitivity. He had been a diabetic for years. His one desire for learning to read Braille was that he had been a ham radio operator and wanted to continue with that hobby. So he needed to be able to read and write down the call numbers used by the people he was communicating with. The rest he could do without reading. So this initial desire led to his learning to use a jumbo slate and stylus and to being able to use it for shopping lists as well. He was anxious to show me his newly learned skills and proud he'd been able to keep up his independence in these areas. Technology, depending on the individual's age, they may have had access to technology which they can adapt for their needs without learning to read Braille. Others simply may feel that the technology is too difficult to learn or just not wish to learn to use it. Braille note takers would seem a very expensive tool if one doesn't already know how to use Braille on the note taker, and it's not always provided by the rehab agencies unless the technology might be required for work. And work situation, therefore, is very important in whether an adult may feel the need to use Braille on the job. Some adults may not be able to continue working in their old jobs for a variety of factors related to safety or simply inability to physically do the job without vision, no matter whether they know Braille or not. Someone who was a roofer is probably not going to be continuing to do that job. And although we know of chefs who are blind, someone who is a chef may not be as desirous of continuing that job without additional training, and there again may not be thinking that Braille would be helpful. So the decision to learn Braille for the job depends on the individual circumstances in which the teacher finds the client. We've covered a lot of miles on this road today. I have a picture on the screen of a road winding through what looks like some pasture land into the distance and a lone car on the road. It looks like it has a long way to go, which is what I think we feel like sometimes when we think about the progress of learning Braille for some of our students. What I'd like to do at this point is just remind ourselves of some of the things that we've covered that will help us smooth out the road for learners. So some bumps are created by our expectations as teachers. We need to teach with an eye towards literacy, and we need to expect that our students will become literate. If we don't expect that our students will attain literacy, we won't do the things that will help them attain it. That's the same for every group of potential Braille readers we talked about. And we do need to remember that teachers need to know Braille. But, and this is a big but, knowing the code is a necessary but not sufficient for teaching Braille. So some bumps are created by a mismatch between the reading program and the learner. Beginning reading programs are not designed necessarily for those who are older, and children with additional disabilities need programs that are going to mesh with their needs and abilities. There are few approaches for teaching older readers. Teachers need to become familiar with everything that's available, and they also may have to think of individualizing it and creating their own. Focusing on what adults have as goals for themselves as readers is really important. And if one approach isn't working, don't give up. Try another. Some bumps are created by lack of knowledge or experience on the part of teachers. This gets us back to our need to have teachers who have that expertise and experience. I'm sure many of you have felt that some or maybe all of what I've talked to you about today are things you already know. And if so, you have that expertise that we're talking about, and most likely you are not a novice teacher but an expert. We spent some time talking earlier about novice teachers compared to expert teachers, and I want to spend just a little bit more time on this. The slide says, novice teachers have difficulty gaining the amount of experience necessary to become an expert with a diverse population. For those of you who feel you have that expertise, take just a minute to think about what areas you feel you have the most expertise in, and how long did it take you to gain it? Almost all of us in this field of education of children and adults with visual impairments, when compared with teachers in the regular classroom, lack the opportunity to grow our teaching experience based upon large numbers of students. When a teacher enters teaching as a novice in a regular school setting, there are other teachers there with whom that teacher can consult when having difficulties with particular students or when having questions about teaching pedagogy. The ordinary first grade teacher, even after just 5 years of teaching, most likely has had experience working with about 125 different students, depending upon the size of her classes. That same teacher can watch those students grow as they move up through the first few years of their education and can develop a certain degree of expertise across the age ranges by interacting with teachers of the older students as they get older. A teacher of children with visual impairments, even one who's teaching in a specialized school setting, simply can never experience those numbers of students. The diversity among their students also ensures that they're continually experiencing situations which differ from those that they previously taught and require a different set of skills. So novice teachers of Braille reading and writing probably need access to expert teachers for longer periods of time than those in regular education. And we feel like we're always upgrading. I don't know what version you are, but I feel like I'm way up there. Over the years, the novice teacher develops the ability to see a bigger picture when looking at students. Research on observations made by novice teachers and experienced teachers on the same classroom setting demonstrate that novices are not really sure at times what to make of what's happening in the classroom. The comments that they make in their observations are short, and they sometimes simply pick out what one or two children are doing. The expert teachers look at a variety of aspects, such as engagement of students, efficacy of the teacher. They evaluate whether the method being used is one that's working, or what a teacher might do to improve it, and they'll go into a lot of depth in their reporting. Too often, our teachers of visually impaired children, through no fault of their own, except the lack of students to work with, do not reach the level of an experienced teacher until well close to the end of their career. Those who have Braille students can never have the same number of students a regular classroom teacher would have, and so it's important in their training that they get as much information as possible about working with students who are Braille readers and are informed about the current best practice information and what research has told us about helping students acquire Braille literacy. But we still need to be able to provide access to experts for our novice teachers. Most of us probably know someone we think of as an expert in Braille literacy, but we may have no clear definition of what an expert would look like and how they might be used. We need to do some brainstorming within our professional organizations and with school districts and with those people whom we think of as experts to determine how we might be able to provide the experts for all of our novice teachers out there who need help so that we can make the road smoother for our potential Braille readers. I promised that I would say something about the coronavirus at the end of this speech. It has certainly changed the way we deliver services to our students and clients, and it's shaped my way of thinking about how we might be able to provide expertise for teachers in the future, how we might be able to use the things we do virtually for helping novice teachers rather than having each school district trying to hire an expert of their own. Experts could be used as a resource by professional preparation programs, by school districts, by agencies working with adult clients. I do think the time is ripe for us to develop a clear definition of what an expert teacher of Braille literacy is, and to define it in relation to those groups of Braille learners we've discussed throughout this talk. Then we need to identify the experts. And when we do that, then we need to get their help and figure out how best to use them with novices who don't already have access to experts while teaching. I am envisioning a time where in the future we will have a cadre of experts who will help us all smooth out the road to Braille literacy for future Braille learners. Thank you, and as I said earlier, please let me hear from you. I appreciate it, and I know you will enjoy the rest of the conference, so bye-bye.